With the cold weather finally setting in, it makes me wish for summer. I've always loved summer because of the freedom. I could stay up late or just do whatever I liked with the days. Now that I'm so close to being an adult, it's fully sunk and I won't ever have that kind of freedom again. When I was 13, I met someone I'll never be able to forget. He was what I thought summer represented. I hope letting others know about our time together makes it so he doesn't fade away into a hazy memory. It was humid on the day we met. I walked down to the corner store to buy popsicles with my small stash of change. The streets were empty. The town I lived in had a low population, but on hotter days it was as if no one lived there at all. With my treat in hand, I left the store without a plan for the rest of the day. I prayed for rain to come to cool off our small town. I first noticed him on my walk back home. An old cemetery was across the street from the store I bought snacks from. Since I walked by it 100 times, the place didn't spook me like some of the other kids my age. Someone short was standing by the locked gates, staring, as if he wanted inside. A large straw sun hat on his head with almost white, blonde shoulder-length hair spilling from under it. At first, I assumed he was a girl because of the longer hair. Since I didn't have anything else to do, I went over to get his attention. "The place is haunted, you know," I said, trying to scare him. His head turned and I was taken aback by how intense his eyes were. He was short and looked 13 at the most, but there was so much behind his eyes that made me think he was older than I was. And, for a second, I thought his eyes looked red instead of blue. I blamed it on the harsh sunlight. Every part of the world is haunted in some way. He spoke in a softer voice that sounded a bit girlish. "Right, hey, wanna share?" He was weird, but I didn't have a lot of friends, so I couldn't be picky. I opened my popsicle and snapped it in half, offering it to him. He looked confused but accepted the offer. "Did you just move here?" I pressed after we ate in silence for a minute. No one came to this town unless they were seeing family, so he wasn't here for a day trip. I've never seen him before, which made me wonder where he came from. "I have a small task here. I'm just waiting for a storm," he said in a cryptic manner. Yeah, really weird, but he was still nice enough. "Do you want to do something?" "There isn't much around here though. If I asked my parents, they might give me money to watch a movie. There is a theater that shows older ones for $2 per person," I offered. "Is that the Stallion Theater? I think they used to let you fill up a large bag of candy for $1 as well." I vaguely remember getting a bag of gummy sharks. He trailed off as if trying to remember the rest of a story. "That place closed when I was 6 or maybe 7. I heard it was pretty awesome. The ticket prices were a lot, but the food was dirt cheap. The new theater is the other way around. Did you grow up here or something?" I hadn't heard anyone but my parents mention that place after it closed. Maybe he moved away around that time or something. Another weird answer. I finished off my popsicle, ready to spend the rest of the day hanging out with my new friend regardless of how odd he was. "I'm Evan. What's your name?" I said. I would have offered to shake hands, but mine were sticky from my treat. I thought I saw a bit of color come to his cheeks, and he acted as if he didn't want to tell me a simple thing like his name. "Ellie." I looked him over again, wondering if I mistook a girl for a boy. He was on the smaller side, but I was positive he was a guy under his baggy t-shirt and shorts. It must be a cute nickname. Whatever. A kid at school went by Donkey, so who cared if Ellie's name was a bit girlish? "Ellie is a girl's name," a voice from behind us spoke. "For a larger kid, Tommy sure could sneak up on people." I hated Tommy. He claimed people didn't like him because of his weight, but it was because he was a dick. No other way to say it. He caused problems whenever he could, then cry victim of "you told him to grow up." He honestly acted like a poorly written school bully on kids' shows. "If he's a boy, then Ellie is a boy's name," I said back, knowing it was just going to make him angry. "And you have a girl hat." With one swift movement, Tommy grabbed Ellie's hat off his head. The bully was taller than us and looked at least 3 years older. I often just took the abuse, knowing I couldn't physically do anything about it. "Did you daddy give you this hat?" Tommy mocked, ready to act if we fought back. "Yes, in fact he did," Ellie said, his tone perfectly calm. His skin was pale, so he needed that hat to not get burned. Tommy sneered, then dropped the hat to the ground. I saw his foot rise, ready to stomp it flat. Ellie did something I didn't expect. He charged forwards, knocking Tommy to the ground. I scooped up the sun hat and started running. Tommy shouted, his face red from anger. His long legs easily caught up with us. He grabbed Ellie by the hair to pull him back. I shouted, praying an adult would see this before the smaller boy got hurt. Ellie didn't take the abuse lightly. He bit Tommy so hard he drew blood. He was tossed to the ground, scrapped his elbows, but he did not let up. With another football tackle, he got Tommy on his back. He sat on his chest and gave the bigger kid a few good punches to the face. I needed to drag him off for us to make our getaway. Ellie shouted some threats. As we left, we ran until we couldn't anymore. We collapsed, faces red and breathing heavy. If Ellie hadn't fought back, Tommy would have ruined the hat and left us alone. I handed the rescued son hat over to him, wondering why he exploded the way he did. My adopted father gave me this, Ellie explained after he recovered. That made sense. No wonder he so fiercely protected it. Tommy wasn't the best person, so getting put in his place for once wasn't the end of the world. In that short interaction, Ellie turned into my hero. I offered to let him come over to my house to get cleaned up. He refused and said he would meet by at the theater after I got more pocket money from my parents. They gladly gave me some when they heard I made a new friend. I lived close to Tommy and I half expected him to come and find me. Thankfully, he kept his distance. That day, when I needed to head home after the movie, Ellie didn't give me a way to contact him. I had email and some social media accounts I only used to chat with friends on, but no cell phone. I just had a shared computer at home. We picked out a meeting spot so we could hang out again the next day. Ellie was late. I wanted to walk along the trails in the woods. I almost went without him. When he arrived, he apologized, saying he had something else to do that day. I easily forgave him so we could start the hike. He wasn't very talkative, and yet he didn't seem indifferent. We took a break after a few hours for me to share the lunch my mother packed and to catch grasshoppers. Ellie didn't seem to understand the appeal of catching bugs. It was as if he hadn't had the chance to just be a kid. He wanted to act like one though. His almost adult personality held him back a little. I heard rumbling off in the distance. At the end of that day, deep down I was convinced Ellie would disappear after a storm rolled through. Thankfully, it didn't rain that night or the next day. We departed promising to see each other again. I only was able to spend less than a week with him. On the fourth day, I requested he come by for lunch. My mother wanted to meet my new friend. She offered to make my favorite meal to bribe me to ask him to come over. He wasn't too keen on the idea of meeting my parents. He was too shy for that sort of thing. After a lot of gentle begging, he caved. I met him at the store so we could walk to my place together. We hadn't seen Tommy since Ellie beat him up. The threat of him had left our minds. That was until we started to walk by his house. An awful noise came from his backyard. An old wooden gate was open, letting me see something that made me run into the yard, not caring about the danger. The damn bastard had a BB gun and found a stray cat to take his boredom out on. The poor skinny cat cowered against the wooden fence, too scared to move. As far as I could tell, he already hit it once. Ellie came with me. He flew over to the scared cat to take it into his arms. The thing buried its small shaking head against his chest as the claws dug into his arms, drawing blood. "Screw off. This is my cat. I can do what I want," Tommy yelled at us. He still had a light bruise on his cheek from where Ellie hit him days ago. I stood between the two, desperately trying to think of something to do besides making a run for it. Tommy raised the gun, the barrel pointing towards Ellie. It was only a BB gun. The small pellets couldn't kill my friend, but I feared he might get his eye shot out or something. Ellie took a few steps forward, scared cat in his arms, and face stern. A breeze blew his sun hat off his head, the string keeping it around his neck. He silently dared Tommy to pull the trigger. His intense gaze wasn't directly at me, yet I still got goosebumps. There was something behind that expression I couldn't place. In that moment, Ellie scared me. Tommy reacted by firing the gun. If it hit Ellie, he didn't react. He would have fired until the gun was empty if his father hadn't seen what was going on. The older man came out of the house in a red-faced rage. I almost felt sorry for Tommy when his father grabbed his arm hard to drag him away, screaming. As he did, the gun was yanked from Tommy's hand and tossed over the fence, the father shouting that he didn't care if Tommy shot animals, but he told him to never shoot a person. I didn't wait around for us to be the next target. We booked it out of there, only stopping in front of my house to catch our breath. Somehow the cat started to calm down in Ellie's arms. At least it was clear how Tommy ended up the way he had. "I think I need to skip lunch," Ellie said, as he nodded towards the cat. "My mom is allergic. Can you take it home?" I asked. "I know someone who can take care of it." But cat aside, it seems I'm needed elsewhere. I followed his gaze down the street. A tall figure stood beside a telephone pole. He wore a large overcoat and a hat to keep his face in the shade. The guy gave me the creeps. He was the type of person parents warn kids to never go near. Ellie wasn't scared in the slightest. "I'll see you later." I let him leave, questions started in my mind, wondering just who Ellie was. He never gave me a last name or anything about himself. I knew he was a nice kid, and yet there was something else to him. My mother was disappointed that I didn't bring a friend over. I told her we found an injured cat, and Ellie took it home. Nothing about Tommy or the BB gun. His parents didn't call mine, which was a relief. I didn't want to deal with any of that. We now needed to be extra careful to avoid Tommy for the rest of the summer. Sadly, that did not happen. The day after the cat incident, I went to the store like usual. To my surprise, I saw Ellie by the drink coolers looking over the choices. He smiled when he saw me, but his expression changed when he caught sight of something behind me. I looked over to see nothing but rows of snacks. "How's the cat?" I asked as I picked out a bottle of pop. The ones in the glass bottles cost more but always felt super fancy when I was younger. "I got one for us both. She's fine. I'm glad we got to her when we did," he said, but then suddenly lowered his voice. "Have you ever heard of Bullfrog Pond?" With how he pulled in closer, it made me think he was about to tell me a secret. I nodded. I knew of it. The small pond was so deep off the trails I never really bothered going there just for some frogs. Honestly, I've barely seen any frogs around here. Just toads. Sneak out and meet me there at midnight, Ellie said in a half whisper. I nodded, confused on why he would ask such a thing. There were no local ghost stories related to the pond. In fact, the pond wasn't special at all, so why ask me to meet me there? We picked out a few more snacks after the short conversation. When I was at the counter to pay, I heard a bell ring. I looked over just as I saw Tommy leaving the store. I wondered why he left without bothering us. Then I realized he wouldn't want to mess with us in a public area. With later plans set, we hung out for a few more hours. Dark storm clouds rolled in, so I went home early that day. The clouds hovered all night, threatening a storm at any moment. I considered staying home. That night, I've never had a reason to sneak out before, and if it did storm, I risked getting caught in the rain while in the woods. I thought of Ellie being alone in the rain waiting for me, so I set an alarm ready to leave in the dark. My parents were dead asleep. They trusted me to never leave the house so late. I wore a rain jacket just in case. The humid air made me regret that choice. I was covered in sweat by the time I found myself on the right path towards the pond. As I walked, I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind me. I looked around with my flashlight and saw something. I blamed the sounds on just how scared I felt being in the woods so late at night. When a hand grabbed my wrist, I jumped out of my skin. I was too scared to even scream. This way, I hissed at Ellie that he gave me a heart attack. Instead of guiding me to the pond, he took me to some bushes that overlooked it. He made us crouch down as if hiding from someone. Once I started, but he shushed me. Sweat rolled down my back as we silently waited. More footsteps came through the woods with a flashlight guiding their way. Another person had come to the pond. I should have already guessed who it was. Tommy came stomping through the brush expecting to find us. Of course, he wanted to find us alone, where no one could interrupt his assault. He overheard Ellie's plan in the store, that much was clear. But Ellie wasn't stupid. He knew this was going to happen, so why bother to sit around and wait? A flash of light appeared through the trees. A boom of thunder came after I counted to 4. The storm was so close. We needed to leave or else we would get caught inside. Instead of leaving, Ellie stood up when Tommy got to the edge of the pond. I whispered to him, not understanding what he was doing. I watched my friend walk to the base of a tree, looking down at a bully that could tear us to pieces. I quickly got beside him, my flashlight in hand, as a weapon just in case. There you two are. I knew I would catch you. I bet you both came down here to fool around. I'll tell everyone that I caught you in the act, Tommy shouted. He pointed his flashlight over to us, the beam of light blinding me for a moment. His threats didn't affect Ellie at all. I felt my face get red from embarrassment. None of what Tommy said was true, and yet I worried because people saw me and Ellie hanging out. They may assume otherwise. You shouldn't be near the pond, Ellie warned in a cold tone. Step away. Don't tell me what to do, Tommy snapped back. I looked over to my friend. What I saw made my blood turn cold. His eyes were no longer bright blue, but a deep red. I couldn't blame the odd light or contacts for the change. I didn't understand what my friend was. I simply knew he wasn't human. Evan, don't move, Ellie said without looking in my direction. I'd taken a step back without realizing it. The wind started to pick up as more thunder echoed through the trees. Do not move until the storm is over. His voice sounded so much like an adult that I nodded my head. Don't ignore me. I'm going to beat both your asses. I'll make sure. Tommy was cut off by a noise that wasn't thunder. A bubbling came from the small pond, followed by 100 croaking sounds at once. He turned to see countless yellow eyes staring from the water. Tommy's mouth fell open into a silent scream. His body was too stunned to move. Then the frogs came, or at least, they were something similar to frogs. Frogs don't have never-ending teeth. All at once the storm came as the creatures poured from the pond. I wanted to run but kept my feet firmly planted in place, obeying Ellie's warning. I watched in sheer terror as those small monsters poured out towards Tommy. They ate everything, the mouths eating more than the bodies should be able to hold. They tore away flesh and bone, the croaking sound mixing in with the thunder and wind. It wasn't just Tommy they devoured. They started eating away the very ground. Each bite revealed a deep darkness of nothing underneath. These creatures weren't just eating the forest floor, but the very concept there had been a part of the forest there to start with. They got ever closer, devouring even the trees that stood in their path. I let out a small scream as they got so close to my feet. My body shook as my rain jacket failed to keep me fully dry. My hurt nearly stopped as the small frog-like monsters nipped just in front of my shoes. As quickly as the storm came, it died down. Soon the black area the frogs created was filled with water, and each frog sank down into the depths. I collapsed when the rain stopped, my mind working overtime to understand what I had just seen. As I ran through what I witnessed, an odd fact dawned on me. I knew there was space between us and the pond before. Now that pond reached our feet. Tommy had been there, but I couldn't remember what that space looked like. Had there been trees? If so, how many? Ellie started to walk away, his clothing and hair soaked from the rain. I picked up my flashlight to follow him. Tommy, I started, unable to finish the thought. Ellie stopped and looked over his shoulder at me, his red eyes giving my arms goosebumps. I did warn him to move, didn't I? He answered in a cold tone. He did, but he also knew Tommy wouldn't have listened. I let Ellie get a head start on walking out of the woods. We didn't speak to each other when we went our separate ways. Even after I was safe in a warm, dry bed, I didn't sleep. For the first time in my life, I came face to face with death. I should have told my parents what happened, or even admitted I left the house that night and said Tommy was missing. I didn't. Instead, I stayed in bed until the afternoon. Then I took some spare change to head to the store. I expected to see him where we first met. He stood across the street, staring into the old graveyard, lost in thought. I walked over to him against my better judgment. He expected this, his blue eyes looking over me, waiting for questions. "Do you know someone buried here?" I asked. I wasn't ready to hear about what happened the night before just yet. An odd expression came over his face as he nodded. He looked much younger as he stared back at the locked gates. "I think so." I didn't press him. I just waited until he was ready to talk again. "I think my father is here," he finally said. "What's his name?" "Unsure, we can find him," I offered. Ellie shook his head, his blonde hair looking whiter than before. "He must be aware of the fact I'm not human by now. I was at some point when I became what I am. I lost a great deal. All my memories of my human life were erased. I carry the personality and memories of those who carried the same powers I now own. At least I always thought every memory was gone. Recently some have come back, small hints of my past life. I think I was born here. My father died here. I don't remember his name or face. I have a feeling he was buried here, and yet I cannot be certain." I nodded with my stomach feeling heavy. I didn't know how I would deal with Ellie's situation. He knew he was missing so many important things without any way of getting them back. The clearest memory of him is us walking down a street. I must have been young because he was so tall. The sunlight was far too bright to see his face. I held his hand as we walked. I felt safe. I know I loved him a great deal, and yet couldn't hold on to anything about him. His expression stayed collected, but I heard the hurt in his voice. I chewed on my bottom lip, thinking about the fact the same person who was telling me all this also led a person to their death the night before. I decided I wanted to do something regardless of if it was a dumb idea or not. I cupped my hands beside my mouth and started to shout towards the graveyard. "Hey, Ellie's dad. He forgot where you are, but he wanted to come and see you. He misses and love you a lot." My face went red as I listened to the empty street, almost expecting a response. Not a single car drove by, leaving us completely alone under the summer sun. "Do you think you heard me?" I asked as I looked over to Ellie. It took a second, but a smile took over his face. He nodded, his eyes looking wet. Ellie brought the brim of his hat down, hiding his expression as he collected himself. "What was with the frogs last night?" I finally asked. "My job is to ensure certain creatures are doing what they're meant to. Those frogs eat everything as you saw. Bit by bit, they'll eat away this world. It could take 100 years, or a few million, but they'll eat away at everything until the pond they live in takes over the very fabric of the universe. Then, they'll eat the pond, and finally themselves. Their purpose is to leave this world as nothing. Ellie exampled. His voice and demeanor changed back to how he acted last night. I felt chills go down my spine hearing what he said. It was such an overwhelming thought. Someday my town, my planet, my entire everything will become nothing. Shouldn't you stop them? I mean, you don't want to be eaten like Tommy. I said, voice shaking. Is that what you think his name was? Do you remember what he looks like? Ellie pointed out. To my shock, I didn't. I knew he was taller and larger, but I didn't remember his face. I didn't even know his last name. People take longer to digest. It may be years until you truly forget him. You'll most likely die before the pond spreads outwards. The powers I carried burn out the hosts. I'll be gone, my job title transferring to another poor soul before that pond even reaches the end of the forest. Even so, this is not the only world out there. What I am will live on. It's my job to ensure those frogs slowly devour this world, for the sake of balance. My head was swimming. He just gave me more questions than answers. Other worlds. Are you an alien of something? I asked, confused. Or something, Ellie said with a smile. He could try to explain what he meant, but I doubted I would ever understand him. Ellie oversaw things way beyond anything I was meant to know about. His reach scared me. The thought of the end scared me. I also felt sad for him. When I burn out, my vague memories of being human shall go with me. Those are destined to be erased like your world. He said, sounded defeated over the fact. Not really. If you go before I do, I'll remember. And we're friends, right? I think that will stay with your powers. When you pass them along, your memories will stay with me after you burn out. And I'll stay with a part of you after this world is gone, right? I watched his face as that concept turned in his head. A breeze came, causing sunlight to dance through his sun hat and across his cheeks. For some reason, I thought he was too important of a person to ever die. I wanted him to outlast this world, or at the very least be able to have some time to act like a kid after that had been robbed from him. I suppose you're right. He sensed eyes on us. I saw the same odd dark figure waiting at the end of the street. Ellie's time was up. He'd finished his job here and needed to get to the next one. I knew I would never see him again after he walked away. I'm sorry I made you see something so frightening. He apologized as he put off leaving. It's okay. I'll just have nightmares for the rest of my life dreading my own mortality, but I think it was worth it. That made him laugh slightly. I didn't think he got the chance to smile very often. I watched him head down the street. He stopped to wave goodbye before he left my sight. I was left standing feeling emptier than I ever had before, my brain still going back to the idea of the pond slowly taking over everything. Even if I wasn't going to live to see it, the idea of everything just being gone someday made me sick. I thought back to that night often through the years since it happened. A year after I met Ellie, my father got a better job, so we moved to a bigger city. With so much going on, I nearly could forget what I learned that night. Everything ends. That scares me. Sometimes it kept me up at night. Would my life even matter in 100 years? Would anything even matter in 1,000? Those thoughts haunted me for a while. It was only after I remembered Ellie's expression after I shouted towards the graveyard, I realized something important. No, my life might not matter in 1,000 years, but things I do matter in the moment, and that's good enough for me to keep going.